There are lines in the universe that should never be crossed. Boundaries written not in law or treaty, but in the very fabric of what makes a species worthy of existence. The Galactic Coalition had ruled the stars for millennia, their advanced civilizations viewing younger races as little more than curiosities to be studied, controlled, or discarded at will. They saw humans as primitive, violent creatures barely worth their attention. Earth was just another backwater world, its people nothing more than an interesting experiment in controlled evolution. The Coalition's xenobiologists found human behavior patterns fascinating, particularly their irrational attachment to their offspring and their tendency toward explosive emotional responses. What they failed to understand was that this wasn't a weakness to be exploited. It was a warning they should have heeded. When the first human colony ships reached the edge of Coalition space, the aliens thought they were witnessing the pathetic struggle of a dying species desperate to expand beyond their dying world. They watched with cold amusement as humans built their small settlements on the frontier worlds, scratching out a meager existence in the shadow of truly advanced civilizations. The Coalition had protocols for dealing with such primitive expansions. Economic pressure. Political manipulation. Carefully orchestrated accidents that would discourage further exploration. They had done this thousands of times before with countless species. Most simply gave up and retreated to their home worlds. The few that didn't usually destroyed themselves through internal conflict. But humans were different. And the Coalition was about to learn exactly how different in the most devastating way possible. The mistake wasn't in underestimating human technology or military capability. Humans were indeed primitive in those regards. The mistake was in fundamentally misunderstanding what humanity valued most and what they would sacrifice everything to protect. The Zephyrians, one of the Coalition's founding species, made the first move. They had perfected the art of psychological warfare over thousands of years, breaking the spirit of resistant species through carefully calculated cruelty. Their research on human behavior suggested that targeting the young would create the desired psychological breakdown that would send humans fleeing back to Earth. They thought they understood human nature. They were catastrophically wrong. What followed that first act of unthinkable cruelty would reshape the very structure of galactic civilization. The Coalition had spent millennia building their empire through careful manipulation and controlled aggression. They had never encountered a species that would willingly burn down the entire galaxy to protect their children. They were about to discover that some forces in the universe are not meant to be awakened. And, once awakened, they cannot be reasoned with, negotiated with, or stopped. This is the story of that awakening. The morning of the Kepler 442b incident started like any other day in the human colony of New Brisbane. Sarah Chen finished her rounds at the medical center just as the twin suns began their climb over the red-tinged horizon. The colony had been thriving for nearly 3 years now, a testament to human stubbornness and ingenuity in the face of a hostile galaxy that seemed determined to keep them confined to Earth. 600 families had made the journey across the void to establish this outpost on the edge of what the Galactic Coalition called civilized space. The Coalition's maps marked this sector as uninhabited wasteland, too resource-poor and strategically insignificant to warrant their attention. That suited the humans just fine. They had learned early that flying under the radar was the only way to avoid the kind of assistance the Coalition offered to primitive species. Sarah's daughter Emma was already awake when she returned to their modest prefabricated home, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her collection of smooth stones she had gathered from the creek that ran behind the colony. At 7 years old, Emma had adapted to their new world with the remarkable resilience that seemed to characterize all the colony children. She could identify the calls of dozen different native bird species and had named most of the larger rock formations visible from their home. "Mama, look what I found yesterday," Emma said, holding up a particularly interesting specimen that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of the light. "Dr. Martinez says it might have metals in it that make it change like that." Sarah knelt beside her daughter, examining the stone with exaggerated interest. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. Maybe we can show it to the geology team later." The colony operated on a simple principle that had served humanity well throughout its expansion into space. Everyone contributed according to their abilities, and everyone's voice mattered in decisions that affected the whole community. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The weekly council meetings could get heated when it came to resource allocation or expansion plans, but they always found a way forward that everyone could live with. Governor James Reeves had just finished his morning briefing with the department heads when the first warning came through from the perimeter sensors. 3 ships had dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, their design matching no known human vessels. The automated systems had already begun broadcasting the standard first contact protocols, transmitting mathematical sequences and basic pictographic representations of peaceful intent. The response came back within minutes, but it wasn't the universal peace symbol or mathematical confirmation that humanity had hoped for in their first real contact with galactic civilization. Instead, the alien ships transmitted detailed scans of the colony's layout, population density readings, and what appeared to be targeting data for the school, medical center, and residential areas. "Sir," Communications Officer Lisa Park said, her voice tight with controlled fear, "they're not responding to any of our standard protocols. The computer's trying to match their transmission patterns against the xenolinguistics database, but these aren't like any of the theoretical models." Reeves studied the tactical display, watching as the 3 ships moved into a standard blockade formation around the planet. Each vessel was roughly 3 times the size of the largest human ship in the colony's small defense fleet. Not that size mattered much when humanity's most advanced weapons were still primarily chemical rockets with nuclear warheads. They had always known that their first contact with an advanced alien species would leave them hopelessly outgunned. "What's their tech level assessment?" he asked. Chief Engineer Rodriguez looked up from his console, his face grim. "Energy readings are off the charts, sir. Their power generation alone is putting out more than our entire colony uses in a month. And the hull composition, it's not showing up on any of our sensors. Whatever they're made of, our computers don't recognize it." The school had just begun its morning session when the alien ships made their first active scan of the colony. The children felt it as a strange tingling sensation, like static electricity building up before a thunderstorm. Mrs. Patterson, the primary teacher, noticed that several of the younger children had stopped their work and were looking around with confused expressions. "I feel funny," 8-year-old Marcus Williams said, raising his hand. "Like when I touched the metal slide after running around." Emma Chen felt it too, a strange buzzing sensation that seemed to come from inside her head. She looked out the window toward the sky, shading her eyes against the glare of the twin suns. There, visible even in daylight, 3 dark shapes hung motionless against the pale blue atmosphere. The alien ships belonged to the Zephyrian hegemony, one of the oldest and most influential members of the Galactic Coalition. For over 2,000 years, they had served as the Coalition's primary experts on primitive species integration and management. Their methods were considered the gold standard for bringing young civilizations into the galactic community in a controlled and profitable manner. High Examiner Vexhai stood on the bridge of the lead vessel, studying the holographic display that showed the human colony in perfect detail. The scanning technology could map individual organic signatures down to the cellular level, identifying age, health status, psychological stress markers, and estimated intelligence levels. The humans registered as remarkably primitive, barely more advanced than the feral species his people had catalogued in the Outer Rim territories. "Initial assessment confirms the preliminary reports," announced senior analyst Kethmore, her voice carrying the characteristic harmonic undertones of her species. "Crude chemical technology, primitive social organization, standard biological reproduction patterns. Intelligence levels are within acceptable parameters for basic labor classification." The Zephyrians had perfected their integration protocols over millennia of contact with younger species. The process was designed to be efficient and profitable, breaking down existing social structures and replacing them with more manageable hierarchies that served coalition interests. The key was identifying the psychological pressure points that would cause the target species to abandon resistance in favor of cooperation. Their extensive research on human behavior patterns had revealed several promising vulnerability vectors. Humans showed excessive emotional attachment to their offspring, often making irrational decisions that prioritized the welfare of their young over the survival of the larger group. This suggested that carefully applied pressure on the juvenile population would create the desired psychological breakdown in the adult leadership. "Begin the standard demonstration protocol," Vexhai ordered. "Target the educational facility and primary care centers. Ensure that the adult population has clear visual access to observe the consequences of non-compliance. The Zephyrian weapon systems powered up with a low harmonic hum that resonated through the hulls of their ships. The technology was elegant in its precision, capable of delivering exactly the right amount of force to achieve the desired psychological impact without causing excessive infrastructure damage. They had used these same techniques on hundreds of worlds, and the results were always the same. A brief demonstration of superior force, followed by the systematic removal of key resistance leaders, followed by the gradual integration of the surviving population into the coalition economic system. Governor Reeves was in the middle of an emergency council meeting when the first energy beam struck the colony school. The building didn't explode or collapse in the dramatic fashion of human weapons. Instead, it simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The molecular bonds that held the structure together were disrupted at the quantum level, leaving nothing but a perfectly circular crater where 23 children and 2 teachers had been moments before. The silence that followed was absolute. The council members stared at the empty space on the tactical display where the school had been marked just seconds earlier. The implications crashed over them like a physical blow, too enormous and terrible to process all at once. "My God," whispered Chief Medical Officer Sandra Kim, her voice barely audible. "The children, all those children." Communications Officer Park's hands shook as she tried to raise the school on the emergency frequency. The only response was static. Outside, parents who had witnessed the impossible disappearance of the building were running toward the crater, screaming names that would never be answered again. Emma Chen had been in the bathroom when the beam struck. She emerged to find an empty hallway where her classroom should have been. The wall had been sheared away as if by an impossibly precise blade, leaving her looking out over a crater that stretched down past the foundation of the building into the bedrock below. Her friends, her teacher, her desk with the drawing she had been working on, all of it was simply gone. The little girl stood at the edge of nothingness, her mind struggling to understand what her eyes were showing her. She called out for Mrs. Patterson, for Marcus, for any of the 22 other children who had been in the main classroom just minutes before. The only answer was the wind blowing across the smooth-sided crater. Sarah Chen was running before the news reached the medical center. Some primitive instinct had triggered the moment she saw the flash of light from the direction of the school, sending her sprinting through the streets with a terror she had never experienced before. She found Emma standing motionless at the crater's edge, staring down into the impossible emptiness. The reunions between the 7 surviving children and their parents played out across the colony as the full scope of the attack became clear. 23 children dead. 2 teachers. The colony's primary educational facility destroyed. And, hanging in the sky above them, 3 alien ships that had demonstrated they could erase human lives with casual precision. High Examiner Vexhai monitored the human response with professional interest. The emotional reactions were even more pronounced than their models had predicted. Adults were displaying clear signs of psychological breakdown, with several requiring physical restraint to prevent them from attempting futile rescue efforts at the crater site. The colony leadership had gone silent, presumably paralyzed by the magnitude of their situation. "Transmit the standard compliance offer," he ordered. "Full text and pictographic supplements. Make it clear that cooperation will prevent further demonstrations." The message that reached the Colony Communications Center was comprehensive and unambiguous. The Galactic Coalition offered the humans of Kepler 442b the opportunity to peacefully integrate into galactic civilization. Their primitive technology and social structures would be upgraded to meet Coalition standards. Their children would receive proper education in Coalition-approved facilities. Their adults would be provided with meaningful work assignments that matched their capabilities and served the greater good of galactic society. Resistance would result in additional demonstrations of Coalition defensive capabilities. Governor Reeves read the message aloud to the emergency council session as parents, teachers, and workers packed into the community center. The words seemed to echo strangely in the large room, their clinical tone making the underlying threat even more chilling. When he finished, the silence stretched on for nearly a minute before anyone found the courage to speak. "They're offering to save us from ourselves," said Dr. Martinez, the colony's chief scientist. His voice carried a bitter edge that none of them had heard before. "How generous of them to murder our children and, then, offer to educate the survivors properly." Chief Engineer Rodriguez was studying the technical specifications that had accompanied the message. The integration timeline is comprehensive. They want to dismantle our government, relocate our population to designated sectors, and assign work details based on their assessment of our capabilities. It's not integration. It's slavery with better marketing. Sarah Chen stood in the back of the room, her daughter pressed against her side. Emma hadn't spoken since they pulled her away from the crater, and Sarah could feel the tremors that ran through the little girl's body every few minutes. Around the room, other parents held their surviving children with the desperate grip of people who had learned that safety was an illusion. "What are our options?" asked Colonial Defense Coordinator Michael Torres, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "We have 3 patrol boats with nuclear missiles and a population of 1,200 people," Reeves replied. "They have weapons that can erase buildings from existence and ships that our best sensors can barely detect. Militarily, we have no options." The discussion that followed covered every possibility they could imagine. Evacuation wasn't feasible, the alien ships controlled the space around the planet and could prevent any escape attempt. Negotiation seemed pointless given that their opening move had been to murder children. Hiding was impossible when the enemy possessed scanning technology that could map individual humans from orbit. That left surrender or resistance. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. The practical arguments for accepting coalition terms were compelling. Continued resistance would likely result in the complete destruction of the colony and the deaths of everyone they were trying to protect. The children who had survived deserved a chance to grow up, even if it was under alien rule. But the other argument was simpler and more powerful: some things were worth dying for. The message they transmitted back to the Zephyrian ships was brief and unambiguous. The human colony of New Brisbane rejected the coalition's terms. They would not surrender their children to alien education programs. They would not accept work assignments from species that considered murder an acceptable negotiating tactic. They would not integrate into a civilization built on the systematic subjugation of younger species. High Examiner Vex High received the response with a mixture of disappointment and professional curiosity. Human stubbornness was a known factor in their psychological profile, but he had expected the demonstration to override their primitive emotional responses. Perhaps their attachment to their offspring was even stronger than the model suggested. "Begin systematic elimination of infrastructure targets," he ordered. "Focus on life support, communication, and transportation. Leave the population centers intact for now." They need to understand that continued resistance will only increase their suffering. The second wave of attacks began at sunset. The power generation facility disappeared in the same silent flash of disrupted molecular bonds. The water treatment plant followed minutes later. Then, the communication array, the spaceport, and the industrial fabrication center. Each strike was precisely calculated to degrade the colony's ability to sustain itself while leaving the human population alive to contemplate their situation. But, as the twin suns set over New Brisbane and the alien ships settled into position for a long siege, something unexpected began happening in the small community. Instead of breaking under the pressure, the humans began adapting. Engineers started working on backup power systems using salvaged components. Medical staff organized rationing protocols for the emergency supplies. Parents took turns watching the children while others worked on defense preparations that everyone knew were futile but somehow necessary. Governor Reeves found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories of the Second World War as he watched his people respond to an enemy that should have crushed their spirits completely. There was something uniquely human about the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds, something that aliens with their rational, efficient civilizations might never understand. What the Zephyrians didn't know, what the entire galactic coalition failed to comprehend, was that the destruction of the colony school had triggered something much larger than a local resistance movement. The automated beacon that Earth had installed in every colony was still functioning, hidden deep underground and designed to activate only under the most extreme circumstances. The beacon was broadcasting a simple message across hyperspace toward Earth and every human colony within range: children killed by alien action. Colony under attack. Require immediate assistance. And, in the vast darkness between the stars, that message was being received by forces that the Galactic Coalition had dismissed as too primitive to pose any real threat. The humans were about to remind the galaxy why apex predators should never be cornered with their young. Admiral Elena Vasquez was reviewing supply requisitions for the Luna shipyards when the priority alert chimed through her personal communication system. The transmission bore the highest possible encryption level and the emergency authentication codes that had never been used in the 43 years since their creation. She read the message 3 times before the words fully registered in her mind. 23 children. Dead. Killed by aliens as a demonstration of power. The Admiral's office aboard the orbital command station fell silent except for the distant hum of life support systems. Outside her viewport, Earth hung blue and white against the starfield, peaceful and seemingly unaware that everything had just changed. Elena had commanded humanity's space forces through pirate raids, asteroid mining disputes, and the occasional terrorist attack by anti-expansion extremists. Nothing in her 30-year career had prepared her for this moment. She activated her secure communication link to Earth Defense Command and watched as General Martinez's face appeared on her screen. His expression told her that he had already received the same message. "Elena," he said without preamble, "tell me our response options." Admiral Vasquez called up the tactical displays that showed humanity's current military assets scattered across 3 star systems. Earth maintained the largest concentration of forces, with 8 heavy cruisers, 24 destroyers, and 42 patrol craft of various classes. The Mars shipyards had another 6 cruisers under construction, while the asteroid mining operations provided a dozen armed industrial vessels that could be converted to military use with minimal modification. Against an alien civilization that could erase buildings from existence with pinpoint precision, it wasn't much. But it was what they had. "Our heaviest ships mount fusion warheads with a maximum yield of 50 megatons," she reported. "Kinetic kill vehicles, particle beam weapons, and electromagnetic pulse generators. We have approximately 1,800 trained combat personnel across all branches, with another 3,000 in the reserves." General Martinez nodded grimly. "And their capabilities?" "Unknown, but clearly beyond anything we've developed. The reports from New Brisbane suggest they can disrupt molecular bonds at the quantum level. That's theoretical physics that we're still trying to understand, let alone weaponize." The strategic reality was inescapable. Humanity was hopelessly outmatched in any direct military confrontation with an alien civilization advanced enough to travel between stars. Their ships were faster, their weapons more powerful, their technology centuries or millennia beyond human understanding. A conventional war would be suicide. But Admiral Vasquez hadn't reached her position by accepting conventional limitations. "General, I'm requesting immediate authorization for Operation Prometheus." The silence on the communication link stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Operation Prometheus was humanity's darkest contingency plan, developed in secret by a small group of military leaders and scientists who had spent their careers preparing for the worst possible scenarios. It violated every treaty humanity had signed regarding weapons of mass destruction, contravened the basic principles of civilized warfare, and would likely result in the complete destruction of human civilization. It was also the only plan they had that might work against a technologically superior enemy. "Elena," General Martinez said slowly, "Prometheus assumes we're fighting a war of extinction." "Are you certain that's what we're facing?" Admiral Vasquez thought about the 23 children who had been erased from existence as a demonstration of power, about the parents who would never hold their sons and daughters again, about the message that had made it clear this was just the beginning unless humanity surrendered completely. "Yes, sir. I believe that's exactly what we're facing." 3 hours later, the emergency session of the Earth Defense Council convened in the secure chambers beneath Geneva. President Morrison had called together the leaders of every major nation and spacefaring organization for a discussion that would determine humanity's response to first contact with alien civilization. The meeting was classified at the highest possible levels, with even the existence of the session itself known only to the 37 individuals in the room. Director Sarah Kim of the Colonial Administration presented the intelligence they had gathered from New Brisbane and the other human settlements in the region. The picture that emerged was grimmer than anyone had hoped. The aliens who had attacked the colony appeared to represent something called the Galactic Coalition, a vast interstellar organization that controlled hundreds of star systems and thousands of species. "According to the data we've been able to extract from their transmissions," Director Kim explained, "humanity is being offered what they call integration assistance. Our children would be removed from their families for proper education. Our adults would be assigned work details based on their assessment of our capabilities. Our technology and culture would be upgraded to meet their standards. Secretary of Defense Williams looked up from the briefing documents. It sounds like they're offering to civilize us. That's exactly how they see it, Director Kim confirmed. From their perspective, they're providing a generous opportunity for a primitive species to join galactic society. The alternative is continued isolation until we either destroy ourselves or evolve beyond our current limitations. And, if we refuse? They've made that quite clear. More demonstrations of their defensive capabilities until we accept their assistance. President Morrison studied the tactical assessments that Admiral Vasquez had provided. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. Humanity possessed fewer than 100 combat-capable vessels, most of them designed for operations within Earth's solar system. Their weapons technology was primitive compared to what the aliens had demonstrated. Their total population across all colonies was less than 2 billion people. The Galactic Coalition, according to the intelligence estimates, controlled thousands of worlds with a combined population in the trillions. They had been spacefaring for millennia while humanity had barely managed to reach nearby star systems in the past century. By every rational measure, resistance was futile. What are our options? The president asked. Admiral Vasquez stood and activated the holographic display that showed Operation Prometheus in all its terrifying detail. The plan was elegantly simple in concept and nightmarishly complex in execution. If humanity couldn't match alien technology, they would have to change the rules of the game entirely. We can't fight their ships, she explained. We can't match their weapons. We can't defend our colonies against an enemy that can strike from space with impunity. But we can make the cost of conquering humanity so high that they decide to look for easier targets. The operation called for the immediate conversion of humanity's entire industrial capacity to military production. Every shipyard would begin building vessels designed for a single purpose, getting close enough to alien targets to detonate the largest nuclear weapons humanity could construct. They would strip the uranium and plutonium from every power plant on Earth if necessary. They would build bombs measured not in kilotons or megatons, but in gigatons. You're talking about turning our entire civilization into a weapon, Secretary Williams said quietly. Yes, Admiral Vasquez replied. Because that's what it's going to take. The strategic concept behind Prometheus was based on a simple but terrible calculation. Humanity might not be able to win a war against the Galactic Coalition, but they could make victories so expensive that their enemies would eventually decide that humans weren't worth the effort. Every alien ship destroyed would cost resources to replace. Every alien world attacked would require additional forces to defend. Every human life lost would be purchased with alien blood. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the lead scientist on humanity's theoretical weapons research program, provided the technical briefing that made Prometheus possible. Her team had been working for years on projects that pushed the absolute limits of human understanding in physics and engineering. Projects that had been purely theoretical until 23 children died on Kepler 442b. We can build fusion weapons with yields approaching 100 gigatons, she explained. The delivery system would be a modified cargo hauler with enhanced shielding and a crew of volunteers. The ships wouldn't survive the mission, but they wouldn't need to. One successful strike against an alien vessel would likely destroy everything within a 10,000-kilometer radius. And the cost? President Morrison asked. Every strategic resource we possess. Every trained engineer and physicist. Every manufacturing facility on Earth and Mars. We would need to convert our entire civilization into a war economy within 6 months. The debate that followed was unlike anything in human history. They were discussing the transformation of their species into something that had never existed before, a civilization built entirely around the principle of mutual assured destruction on an interstellar scale. They would become the galaxy's most dangerous species not through superior technology or larger numbers, but through sheer willingness to pay any price and sacrifice anything to protect their children. The vote was closer than Admiral Vasquez had hoped, but sufficient to authorize the operation. 23 votes in favor, 14 opposed. Humanity would bet everything on a strategy that most military theorists would have called insane under any other circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. An alien civilization had murdered human children as a negotiating tactic. That changed everything. While Earth's leadership debated strategy and resource allocation, the situation at New Brisbane was deteriorating rapidly. The Zephyrians had settled into a systematic siege designed to break human resistance through gradual degradation of their ability to survive. They destroyed one infrastructure target per day, always during the hours when the colonists would be watching, always preceded by a demand for surrender. Governor Reeves found himself thinking more and more about his grandfather's war stories as he watched his people adapt to impossible conditions. The old man had fought in the Pacific Theater and always insisted that the Japanese had made one critical mistake: they had attacked American civilians without understanding what that would unleash. Looking up at the alien ships that hung motionless in his sky, Reeves wondered if the Zephyrians were making the same error. Sarah Chen had stopped sleeping. Her daughter Emma still hadn't spoken since the attack on the school, and the little girl would wake up screaming from nightmares several times each night. During the day, Emma followed her mother everywhere with the desperate grip of a child who had learned that safety was an illusion. The other surviving children showed similar symptoms. They had been marked by something that human psychology wasn't equipped to process. The colony's chief medical officer had done her best to provide counseling and support, but there were no textbooks for treating children who had watched their friends simply cease to exist. The trauma went beyond anything in human experience, into territory that would require entirely new approaches to healing. But something else was happening among the survivors that the aliens couldn't understand or predict. The shared experience of loss was creating bonds between the colonists that went deeper than anything they had known before. Parents who had lost children found themselves caring for orphan survivors with fierce protective instincts. Adults who had never worked together were collaborating on projects that should have been impossible with their limited resources. Chief Engineer Rodriguez had organized teams that were building weapons from mining equipment and farming tools. They wouldn't be effective against alien ships, but the act of creating them gave people something to do with their grief and rage. Dr. Martinez was working with volunteer teams to map the alien patrol patterns and identify potential vulnerabilities in their formation. Colonial Defense Coordinator Torres had started training sessions that taught basic military tactics to anyone who wanted to learn. None of it would make a difference in any practical sense. But it kept people focused on resistance rather than surrender, and that was worth more than the aliens understood. High Examiner Vexhai was beginning to find the human response problematic from a professional standpoint. His models predicted that systematic infrastructure destruction should have broken their resistance within the first week. Instead, the humans seemed to be adapting to their degraded circumstances with remarkable creativity. They had established backup power systems using equipment salvaged from destroyed facilities. They had organized water collection and purification systems that didn't require their damaged treatment plants. They had even started growing food using hydroponic systems built from medical equipment and industrial chemicals. Most concerning from Vexhai's perspective was the complete absence of surrender negotiations. Every previous species his people had integrated had produced at least a faction willing to discuss terms once the demonstrations began. The humans showed no such pragmatism. Their communications consisted entirely of demands that the Zephyrians leave their system, threats of retaliation that were obviously empty given their primitive technology, and increasingly creative insults that his translation systems struggled to process accurately. "Senior analyst," he said, calling Kethmore to his position at the tactical display, "are we certain that our psychological assessments of this species are accurate?" Kethmore consulted her data systems and reviewed the extensive files on human behavior patterns. All indicators confirm the baseline analysis, High Examiner. They show excessive attachment to offspring, irrational emotional responses to perceived threats, and poor long-term strategic planning capabilities. The integration protocols should be effective. Then, why are they still resisting? It was a question that would have profound implications for the Galactic Coalition's understanding of human nature. The Zephyrians had built their civilization on the principle that rational analysis always produced rational responses. They could model the behavior of any species once they understood its basic psychological drives and survival imperatives. What they failed to understand about humans was that rationality wasn't the primary factor in their decision-making process when their children were threatened. The death of 23 children had triggered something that transcended logical analysis or strategic calculation. It had awakened something that the galaxy hadn't seen in a very long time, a species willing to sacrifice everything for principles that couldn't be quantified or negotiated. The Zephyrians were about to discover that some forces in the universe operate according to rules that no amount of technological advancement can overcome. And, in the dark space between the stars, humanity's response was already beginning. Admiral Vasquez's preliminary orders had reached every human settlement and industrial facility in known space. The greatest mobilization in human history was underway, focused on a single objective that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. They were going to make the galaxy remember what happened when someone harmed human children. The asteroid mining station Prometheus 7 had been hastily constructed in the outer belt of the Tau Ceti system, hidden among the debris field of a shattered planetoid where long-range sensors would have difficulty distinguishing artificial structures from natural rock formations. Chief Engineer Malcolm Foster watched through reinforced viewports as the final components of humanity's most ambitious project were maneuvered into position by teams of workers in powered armor. Project Damocles represented everything that humanity could build when they abandoned every safety protocol, environmental regulation, and ethical consideration that had governed their expansion into space. The weapon being assembled in the shadow of Tau Ceti's dying star violated every treaty humans had ever signed regarding weapons of mass destruction. It was also their only chance of convincing an alien civilization that conquering humanity would cost more than it was worth. The fusion warhead at Damocles' core contained enough fissionable material to power a small city for decades. When detonated, it would release energy equivalent to 200 gigatons of conventional explosives, enough to sterilize a planet's surface or vaporize anything within 50,000 kilometers of ground zero. The delivery system was a modified heavy freight hauler equipped with experimental shielding and crewed by volunteers who understood that their mission was strictly one way. Engineer Foster had submitted his name for the crew roster 3 weeks earlier, the day after he received confirmation that his nephew had been among the children killed at New Brisbane. The boy had been 8 years old and, obsessed with spacecraft design, always asking questions about engine efficiency and hull construction that displayed an intuitive understanding of engineering principles. He would have made an excellent spacer someday. Now he was part of the statistical data that justified Project Damocles. Final systems check complete, reported Senior Technician Lou, her voice carrying the exhaustion that had become universal among the project teams. They had been working 18-hour shifts for months, pushing themselves and their equipment beyond all reasonable limits to meet the impossible deadlines that Admiral Vasquez had established. Fusion containment is stable, guidance systems are online, and the volunteer crew has completed their training protocols. Foster nodded and activated his communication link to the command center hidden deep within the asteroid's core. Control, this is engineering. Damocles is ready for deployment. The response came back immediately. Acknowledged, engineering. Stand by for final authorization codes. Across human space, similar conversations were taking place at a dozen other facilities that had been constructed with desperate speed and absolute secrecy. Humanity was building an arsenal that would have been unthinkable just months earlier, weapons designed not for conquest or territorial expansion, but for a single purpose, making their species too dangerous to be safely conquered. Each Damocles unit represented the combined resources of an entire star system. The uranium and plutonium had been stripped from every power plant and research facility humans could access. The construction teams had worked around the clock in conditions that would have been illegal during peacetime, accepting casualty rates that peacetime administrators would have considered unacceptable. The volunteer crews had been selected from thousands of applicants who understood that their mission would end in certain death. None of it would bring back the children who had died at New Brisbane. But it might prevent the same thing from happening to other human children on other human worlds. Admiral Vasquez reviewed the deployment schedules from her command center aboard the Luna orbital platform, watching as humanity's deadliest weapons moved toward their assigned positions throughout known space. The strategy was brutally simple: every alien ship, every alien world, every alien installation that posed a threat to human settlements would become a potential target for a Damocles strike. The Galactic Coalition could destroy human colonies, but they would pay a price that escalated with every attack. The mathematical models were encouraging, assuming that alien psychology operated according to rational cost-benefit analysis. Each Damocles unit could destroy targets worth millions of times its construction cost. A single successful strike against an alien fleet would eliminate ships that had taken decades to build and train. A strike against an alien world would remove an entire population center that had required centuries to develop. If humans could maintain a 1-to-10 exchange ratio, the coalition would eventually decide that humanity wasn't worth the resources required to conquer them. If they could achieve 1-to-100, the aliens might actually negotiate rather than fight. The plan depended on human willingness to accept casualties that no civilization in galactic history had ever sustained voluntarily. But, then, no civilization in galactic history had ever been stupid enough to start a war by murdering children. Dr. Rebecca Chen was running final calculations on the Mark 7 fusion warheads when her assistant brought her the message she had been dreading for weeks. Her daughter Sarah had transmitted an emergency update from New Brisbane. The situation at the colony was deteriorating faster than expected, and the Zephyrian ships were preparing for what appeared to be a final assault on the surviving population. Rebecca read the transmission 3 times, trying to process the clinical language her daughter had used to describe the systematic destruction of everything that made the colony livable. Power generation was down to emergency levels. Water supplies were critically low. Medical facilities had been reduced to a first aid station with whatever supplies the staff could salvage from the wreckage of the hospital. Most critically, the alien ships had changed their pattern of attacks. Instead of destroying one target per day in a predictable schedule, they had begun random strikes against residential areas during sleep periods. The psychological impact was exactly what the Zephyrians intended. The colonists could no longer predict when or where the next attack would occur, leaving them in a state of constant terror that was breaking down their ability to maintain organized resistance. "Doctor," her assistant said quietly, "the Admiral wants to know if you can accelerate the deployment timeline for Damocles 7. Rebecca looked at the construction schedules and resource allocation charts that covered every available surface in her laboratory. Damocles 7 was the unit assigned to the Kepler 442 system, the weapon that would carry humanity's response to the species that had murdered her granddaughter and 22 other children. The timeline showed completion in 6 weeks, followed by a 2-week transit to the target system. Her daughter and the other survivors at New Brisbane didn't have 8 weeks. "Tell the Admiral that we can have Damocles 7 ready for deployment in 72 hours, she said. "But the crew will have to complete their training en route, and we'll be using experimental containment systems that haven't been fully tested." "Are you certain the weapon will function properly?" Dr. Chen thought about 7-year-old Emma Chen, who had watched her classmates simply cease to exist and hadn't spoken since. She thought about all the parents who would never again hear their children's voices, never again watch them discover something new about the world they were exploring together. "It will function," she said. "I guarantee it." The Zephyrian siege of New Brisbane had entered its 4th week when High Examiner Vexai received the intelligence report that changed everything. Coalition monitoring stations throughout the region had detected unusual energy signatures emanating from several human star systems, readings that suggested massive construction projects and the movement of large industrial assets. More concerning were the uranium and plutonium signatures that indicated humanity was engaging in nuclear weapons development on a scale that seemed far beyond their technological capabilities. Senior analyst Vexai called, "What is your assessment of these readings?" Kethmore consulted her databases and ran the energy signatures through their pattern recognition systems. The data suggests large-scale manufacturing operations focused on weapons development. The nuclear material concentrations are unprecedented for a species at their technological level. "Are you suggesting that they're building weapons capable of threatening our ships?" High Examiner, the energy levels we're detecting suggest weapons capable of threatening our worlds. The implications sent a chill through Vexai's rational thought processes. The Coalition's integration protocols were designed to work against species that valued their own survival above their political independence. A species willing to build weapons of mass destruction rather than accept integration was moving outside the established parameters of civilized behavior. He activated his communication link to Coalition High Command, requesting immediate consultation with the strategic planning divisions. The human response to integration assistance was evolving beyond anything their models had predicted. and HFY was beginning to suspect that his people had fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. The response from High Command came back within hours, carrying authorization codes that HFY had never seen before. Coalition Strategic Command was dispatching a full intervention fleet to the human territories, consisting of 12 heavy battleships, 48 escort vessels, and enough troop transports to occupy every human world simultaneously. The mission parameters were unambiguous: complete pacification of the human species through whatever means necessary. The message made it clear that humanity had crossed a line that the coalition could not allow any species to cross. Building weapons capable of threatening established coalition members was an act of aggression that required immediate and overwhelming response. The integration assistance programs were being suspended in favor of direct military occupation. What the coalition leadership failed to understand was that their escalation was exactly what humanity had been planning for. Admiral Vasquez had anticipated that large-scale weapons development would eventually trigger a massive alien response. The entire strategy depended on drawing as many coalition resources as possible into human space, where they could be destroyed by weapons that cost a tiny fraction of their replacement value. Governor Reeves received the warning about the incoming alien fleet through channels that shouldn't have existed. The emergency beacon that had been broadcasting from New Brisbane had been doing more than requesting assistance. It had been receiving regular intelligence updates from Earth, Mars, and the other human colonies, keeping the isolated defenders informed about humanity's response to the attack on their children. The news that a fleet of alien battleships was approaching their system should have been terrifying. Instead, Reeves found himself feeling something he hadn't experienced since the siege began: hope. The aliens were bringing more targets within range of human weapons, and every ship they committed to the human conflict was a ship that wouldn't be available to threaten other species in the galaxy. He called together the surviving colony leadership for what they all understood would be their final briefing. The alien fleet would arrive within 48 hours, and there was no possibility that the colonists would survive the assault that followed. But their deaths would serve a purpose that went far beyond their small settlement on the edge of civilized space. "We've received confirmation that Damocles 7 is en route to our system," he announced to the assembled group. "The weapon will arrive approximately 6 hours after the alien fleet. Our job is to keep as many alien ships in the system as possible until our people can deliver humanity's response." Chief Engineer Rodriguez looked up from the tactical displays that showed their improvised defenses scattered around the colony perimeter. "What kind of response are we talking about, Governor?" Reeves activated the holographic display that showed the technical specifications for the Damocles warhead. The numbers were so large that they seemed abstract, like theoretical calculations rather than practical engineering data. 200 gigatons. Effective destruction radius of 50,000 kilometers. Enough energy to vaporize everything in the system except the star itself. We're talking about the kind of response that makes sure nobody ever again thinks it's safe to murder human children. The silence that followed was different from the despair that had characterized their meetings in the early days of the siege. This was the silence of people who had accepted their deaths but found meaning in the manner of their dying. They would not live to see their children grow up or return to Earth or build new homes among the stars. But their sacrifice would carry a message that would echo across the galaxy for generations. Sarah Chen held her daughter Emma close as she listened to the governor's words. The little girl still hadn't spoken since the attack on the school, but she seemed to understand that something important was happening. She looked up at her mother with eyes that held too much knowledge for a 7-year-old, too much understanding of loss and grief and the terrible things that civilized beings could do to each other. "Mama," Emma said, speaking for the first time in weeks, "are the bad people going to come back?" Sarah thought about the alien fleet approaching their world, about the weapon that was racing through hyperspace to meet them, about the war that was beginning between her species and an alien civilization that considered child murder an acceptable negotiating tactic. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "But, this time, we're ready for them." The Damocles 7 completed its final approach to the Kepler 442 system as the Zephyrian fleet settled into orbital bombardment formation around the human colony. Commander Jessica Torres had volunteered for the mission knowing that her brother Miguel had died in the attack on New Brisbane, and she found herself thinking about him as she ran through the final arming sequences for humanity's deadliest weapon. Miguel had been a teacher at the colony school, one of the 2 adults who had died when the building simply ceased to exist. He had dedicated his life to helping children learn about the universe they lived in, showing them how to ask questions and find answers and build better futures than the ones their parents had known. The aliens who murdered him had probably never bothered to learn his name. They would remember it now. "All systems green," reported her crew chief over the ship's internal communication system. "Fusion containment is stable, guidance systems are locked onto the primary target, and the countdown is at T-30 minutes. Commander Torres looked out through the reinforced viewport at the alien ships that hung in space ahead of them. The Zephyrian fleet was impressive by any measure, each vessel larger and more advanced than anything humanity had ever built. Their weapons could destroy cities from orbit. Their shields could deflect any conventional attack. Their crews probably included species that had been traveling between stars when humanity was still learning to make fire. None of that would matter in 29 minutes and 17 seconds. "Message to all human forces in the system," she said, activating the general communication frequency. "This is Damocles 7. You have 30 minutes to reach minimum safe distance. Repeat, you have 30 minutes to reach minimum safe distance." The response came back from the New Brisbane colony within seconds. "Damocles 7, this is Governor Reeves. We're staying to observe the results. Someone needs to witness what happens when you threaten human children." Commander Torres understood. The colonists had earned the right to watch their enemies die, even if it cost them their own lives. She would have made the same choice in their position. "Acknowledged, Governor. It's been an honor." The final countdown began as humanity prepared to announce its presence on the galactic stage with a demonstration of force that would reshape interstellar politics for centuries to come. The aliens had started this war believing that humans were too primitive and emotional to pose any real threat to galactic civilization. They were about to learn how wrong they were. High Examiner Vexhai was reviewing the final bombardment coordinates for the human colony when his sensor operator reported an anomalous contact approaching from the outer system. The object was moving at significant velocity and broadcasting identification codes that registered as human origin, though its energy signature suggested technology far beyond what the species should possess. "Classification?" Vexhai inquired, though something about the sensor readings was triggering alarm protocols in his mind. "Single vessel, heavy construction, crew complement appears minimal," the operator reported. "Energy readings are unprecedented, High Examiner. The power core is generating more energy than our entire fleet combined." The tactical display updated to show the approaching vessel's trajectory, and Vexhai felt the first stirring of genuine concern. The ship was on a direct intercept course with the fleet formation, and preliminary analysis suggested that it had no intention of changing direction. Either the humans were attempting a suicide attack with their most advanced vessel, or they were about to demonstrate technology that coalition intelligence had completely failed to detect. "Transmit standard warning protocols," Vexhai ordered. "If they do not alter course within 10 minutes, eliminate the vessel." The warning was transmitted across multiple frequencies in 17 different languages, including the primitive human dialects they had catalogued during their initial contact. The message was unambiguous: change course or be destroyed. The human vessel's only response was to increase velocity and begin broadcasting a signal that their translation systems couldn't process. What the Zephyrians didn't understand was that the transmission wasn't intended for them. Commander Torres was sending final status updates to every human settlement within communication range, ensuring that the results of humanity's first strategic strike would be properly documented and disseminated. Future generations needed to understand what had happened here and why it had been necessary. "All human stations, this is Damocles 7, she broadcast across the emergency frequencies. We are beginning our final approach. Target confirmation is positive for 12 primary vessels and approximately 40 escort craft. Estimated enemy casualties will be complete." The response came back from Admiral Vasquez herself, transmitted from the Luna Command Center with the authorization codes that committed humanity to a war of extermination against any species that threatened their children. "Damocles 7, you are authorized to prosecute your mission. Give them hell, Commander." Torres activated the manual override systems that would prevent any possibility of the weapon being stopped or diverted during its final approach. The fusion warhead was now armed and targeted, its detonation sequence locked onto coordinates that would place it in the exact center of the Zephyrian fleet formation. Even if her ship was destroyed before reaching the optimal firing position, the weapon would continue to its target and complete its mission. High Examiner Vex High ordered the fleet to open fire when the human vessel reached the 10-minute mark without altering course. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with every ship in the formation directing their primary weapons at the approaching target. Energy beams that could vaporize asteroids focused on the small human craft, creating a display of destructive power that should have reduced any known vessel to component atoms. The human ship continued its approach without deviation. "Impossible," muttered senior analyst Kethmore, staring at sensor readings that made no sense according to any physics she understood. "They're absorbing energy levels that should exceed any possible shielding technology." What the Zephyrians couldn't know was that the Damocles 7 had been designed according to principles that prioritized function over survival. The experimental shielding systems were consuming the ship's entire power output and would fail catastrophically within minutes, but they only needed to function long enough to deliver their cargo to the target coordinates. Commander Torres felt the vibrations through the ship's hull as the alien weapons overwhelmed their defensive systems one by one. Her crew chief reported cascade failures throughout the vessel, with critical systems going offline faster than they could be repaired. The ship was dying around them, but it was dying in exactly the manner they had planned. 2 minutes to optimal firing position, she announced to her crew. All personnel to final stations. The men and women aboard the Damocles 7 had trained for this moment through months of simulations and theoretical exercises, but the reality was different from anything they had imagined. The alien weapons were tearing their ship apart section by section, and they could feel the hull plating beginning to fail under the sustained bombardment. Emergency lighting flickered as power systems overloaded and backup generators struggled to maintain critical functions. None of it mattered anymore. The weapon was armed, the target was locked, and the mission would be completed regardless of what happened to their ship or their crew. Governor Reeves watched the approaching confrontation from the observation deck of the colony's emergency shelter, one of the few structures that had survived the weeks of systematic bombardment. Around him, the surviving colonists had gathered to witness what they all understood would be the final act of their settlement's existence. Sarah Chen held her daughter Emma as they watched the lights in the sky that marked the alien fleet's position. The little girl had been asking questions about the approaching ship and what was going to happen, displaying the kind of curiosity that had made her such a joy to teach before the attack on the school had changed everything. "Mama, why are the bad people shooting at our ship?" Emma asked, pointing at the flashes of energy that were visible even from the planet's surface. Sarah thought about how to explain interstellar warfare and weapons of mass destruction and the terrible mathematics of mutual assured destruction to a 7-year-old who had already seen too much of the universe's capacity for cruelty. "Because they don't understand that some things are more important than winning," she said finally. "But they're about to learn." High Examiner Vex High was beginning to suspect that his fleet had made a fundamental error in tactical assessment when the human vessel reached firing position despite sustaining damage that should have been absolutely lethal. The ship was obviously dying, with atmosphere venting from multiple hull breaches and power fluctuations that indicated imminent core failure, but it was still maintaining course and velocity toward the fleet formation. "All ships, implement emergency dispersion protocol," he ordered, though he knew it was already too late. Whatever the humans were planning, they had committed to it with the kind of absolute determination that civilized species reserved for existential threats to their survival. The Zephyrian ships began accelerating away from their formation positions, but faster-than-light travel required time to calculate navigation solutions and charge the hyperdrive systems. Time they didn't have as the human vessel completed its final approach and Commander Torres activated the detonation sequence that would announce humanity's entry into galactic politics. "Damocles 7 to all human forces," she transmitted on the emergency frequency. "Mission accomplished. Tell them what happens when they threaten our children." The fusion warhead detonated at exactly the coordinates that Dr. Rebecca Chen had calculated to achieve maximum tactical effect against the Zephyrian fleet. 200 gigatons of nuclear fire expanded outward at a significant percentage of light speed, creating a sphere of destruction that encompassed everything within 50,000 kilometers of ground zero. The Zephyrian heavy battleship that had served as Vex High's flagship simply ceased to exist, along with 7 other primary vessels that had been caught within the weapon's immediate kill radius. The escort craft that had been positioned farther from the center of the formation suffered varying degrees of damage, with some destroyed outright while others were left crippled and drifting in space with their crews dead or dying from radiation exposure. High Examiner Vexhai had approximately 3 seconds to comprehend what the humans had done before the energy wave reached his ship's position and converted his consciousness into high-energy plasma. His final thought was a mixture of professional admiration and existential terror as he realized that humanity had just demonstrated a willingness to accept casualties that no rational species would consider acceptable. The coalition had been fighting civilized wars for millennia, conflicts governed by careful rules and rational objectives. They had never encountered an enemy willing to sacrifice everything for principles that couldn't be quantified or negotiated. They were learning. Governor Reeves and the surviving colonists watched the new star that blazed in their sky for nearly 10 minutes before the light began to fade. The energy release was visible from the planet's surface despite occurring in deep space, a testament to the sheer magnitude of the force that humanity had unleashed against their enemies. "Is it over?" asked Emma Chen, looking up at her mother with eyes that held more hope than they had shown in weeks. Sarah thought about the other Damocles weapons that were being deployed throughout human space, about the alien fleets that were approaching other human colonies, about the war that was just beginning between her species and a galactic civilization that had made the mistake of murdering children. "No, sweetheart," she said. "It's just starting." The destruction of the Zephyrian intervention fleet sent shock waves throughout the galactic coalition that had nothing to do with the physical effects of the weapon. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a primitive species had inflicted significant casualties on an established coalition member through deliberate use of weapons of mass destruction. The implications were staggering from both military and political perspectives. Coalition High Command convened an emergency session within hours of receiving the initial reports from Kepler 442. The assembled representatives included the leadership of all major member species, military commanders who had overseen the integration of dozens of primitive civilizations, and strategic analysts who specialized in threat assessment and resource allocation. The discussion that followed challenged fundamental assumptions about how galactic civilization operated. The coalition's entire system was built on the principle that rational species would always choose survival over destruction when faced with overwhelming technological superiority. Humanity had just demonstrated that this assumption was false. Supreme Coordinator Thax Wel of the Hegemony Council activated the holographic display that showed the tactical analysis of the human weapon. The energy readings were unprecedented for a species that had been classified as barely above primitive status just months earlier. More concerning was the intelligence suggesting that this was not an isolated prototype, but part of a coordinated weapons development program spanning multiple star systems. Military Assessment Division, Thax Wel intoned, his species' harmonic vocalizations carrying undertones of controlled concern, provide your analysis of human strategic capabilities. General Cathvar of the Coalition Defense Forces had commanded successful integration campaigns against 43 species over his career. He had never encountered anything like what the humans had just demonstrated. The tactical data suggested a level of commitment to total warfare that exceeded anything in recorded galactic history. Supreme Coordinator, our preliminary assessment suggests that humanity has committed their entire industrial capacity to weapons development, he reported. Energy signatures indicate at least 12 additional weapons of similar destructive potential, with deployment patterns suggesting they intend to target any coalition assets that enter human-controlled territory. And their strategic objective? General Cathvar consulted his data systems and reviewed the intelligence reports from multiple sources. The picture that emerged was unlike anything the coalition had faced before. Humanity wasn't trying to conquer territory or expand their sphere of influence. They weren't seeking better integration terms or negotiating for political autonomy. They were implementing a strategy of mutual assured destruction on an interstellar scale. Supreme Coordinator, we believe they intend to make the cost of conquering their species prohibitively expensive. Every coalition asset deployed against human targets becomes a potential target for weapons that cost a fraction of their replacement value. The implications were staggering. If humanity could maintain their current production rate and tactical effectiveness, they could potentially destroy coalition fleets faster than they could be replaced. The economic mathematics were simple and terrifying. It cost humanity the resources of one star system to build a weapon that could destroy assets worth hundreds of star systems. Strategic analyst Vorthmel provided the political assessment that made the situation even more complex. Supreme Coordinator, if we allow a primitive species to successfully resist integration through weapons of mass destruction, it sets a precedent that could destabilize our entire system of galactic governance. Other species may conclude that building such weapons is preferable to accepting integration assistance. FaxWEL considered the options available to the coalition leadership. They could escalate their military response, deploying enough ships to overwhelm human defenses through sheer numbers. They could attempt to negotiate a settlement that allowed humanity limited autonomy in exchange for ceasing weapons development. They could implement a complete blockade of human space and wait for their civilization to collapse under the pressure. All of these options carried risks that the coalition had never been forced to accept before. Escalation would cost resources on a scale that could destabilize their economy. Negotiation would establish the precedent that primitive species could demand concessions through the use of weapons of mass destruction. A blockade would tie up coalition assets for decades while other species observed that humanity was successfully resisting integration. The decision that emerged from the emergency session represented a compromise that satisfied no one completely but offered the best chance of containing the human threat without compromising coalition principles. They would implement what they called graduated escalation, a campaign designed to systematically destroy human civilization's ability to build and deploy weapons of mass destruction. It was a rational response to an irrational enemy, a calculated strategy for dealing with a species that had abandoned calculation in favor of absolute commitment to principles that the coalition couldn't understand or predict. It was also exactly what Admiral Vasquez had been hoping they would choose. The coalition's strategy of graduated escalation would require them to deploy enormous resources against human targets throughout known space. Every ship committed to the human conflict would be a potential target for Damocles' weapons. Every world they conquered would require occupation forces that could be eliminated by weapons that humanity was building faster than they could be stopped. The aliens had responded to the murder of 23 children by committing to a war that would consume their civilization's resources for decades. They had no idea that this was exactly what humanity had planned from the beginning. Admiral Vasquez received the intelligence reports about coalition fleet movements with satisfaction that bordered on anticipation. The enemy was bringing exactly the kind of force concentration that made Damocles' weapons most effective. Large fleets moving in predictable patterns toward known targets, following tactical doctrines that had been designed for civilized warfare against rational opponents. They were about to discover that humanity was neither civilized nor rational when their children were threatened. The war for the galaxy's future was about to begin in earnest, and both sides were confident that their enemy had made a fatal error in strategic judgment. Only one of them was right. The question was which one would realize their mistake before it was too late to change course. The war had been raging for 18 months when Supreme Coordinator FaxWEL finally understood the true scope of humanity's strategy. The latest intelligence reports covered his conference table like an autopsy of galactic civilization, each document detailing another coalition defeat, another fleet destroyed, another world evacuated in the face of human weapons that seemed to multiply faster than they could be eliminated. The numbers told a story that challenged everything the coalition thought they knew about warfare, economics, and the rational behavior of sentient species. Humanity had lost 67 colonies, 3 billion people, and their entire merchant fleet. By any reasonable measure, they should have surrendered months ago or collapsed into complete societal breakdown under the pressure of sustained military assault. Instead, they had become more dangerous with every defeat. General Cathvar, FaxWEL said, his harmonic vocalizations carrying frequencies that indicated deep concern among his species, provide the current strategic assessment. The general activated the holographic display that showed the theater of operations spanning nearly 1,000 star systems. Red markers indicated coalition assets, blue showed human territories, and the white symbols scattered throughout marked the locations of Damocles detonations over the past year and a half. There were far too many white symbols. Supreme Coordinator, we have confirmed the destruction of 237 coalition vessels, including 43 heavy battleships and 6 dreadnought-class command ships, the general reported. Total personnel casualties exceed 4 million, with another 2 million evacuated from worlds within human weapons range. And human casualties? Approximately 3 billion dead, with their remaining population scattered across fortified positions throughout their territory. However, the general paused, consulting data that his strategic training insisted couldn't be accurate. Intelligence suggests they are still producing Damocles weapons at an accelerated rate. Current estimates indicate they now possess over 200 deployable units. FaxWEL studied the tactical display, trying to comprehend how a species could sustain weapons production while losing 90% of their population and industrial infrastructure. Human behavior defied every model the coalition possessed for predicting the conduct of warfare, economics, and social organization under extreme pressure. How is continued production possible given their casualty rates? Strategic analyst Vorthmel provided the assessment that had been disturbing coalition leadership for months. Supreme Coordinator, Human Industrial Organization has adapted to warfare in ways that we did not anticipate. They have converted their entire civilization into what appears to be a distributed weapons manufacturing system. Every surviving settlement, every asteroid mining operation, every deep space facility has been retooled for Damocles production. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a species that had abandoned every priority except the construction and deployment of weapons capable of destroying coalition fleets. Human settlements no longer produced consumer goods, recreational facilities, or even basic medical supplies beyond what was necessary for immediate survival. Every resource, every trained technician, every available piece of equipment had been dedicated to a single purpose: building weapons that could kill aliens who threatened human children. They've transformed their entire species into a weapon, Vorthmel continued. Current projections suggest they can sustain production indefinitely as long as any significant population survives. The implications were staggering from both military and economic perspectives. The coalition was fighting an enemy that cared nothing for territorial control, resource acquisition, or even long-term survival. Humanity had committed to a strategy that guaranteed their eventual extinction while maximizing the cost they could inflict on their enemies before they died. It was magnificent in its insanity and terrifying in its effectiveness. Admiral Vasquez reviewed the latest casualty reports from her command center, which had been relocated to a heavily fortified asteroid base in the outer reaches of the Sol system. Earth itself was gone, reduced to radioactive debris by coalition bombardment 3 months earlier. Mars had followed 2 weeks later, along with the Luna installations and most of humanity's major population centers. The loss of 3 billion people should have broken human resistance completely. Instead, it had clarified their strategic objectives in ways that made the war simpler to understand and easier to prosecute. They were no longer fighting to preserve human civilization as it had existed. They were fighting to ensure that alien species never again felt safe threatening human children. Status report on current Damocles deployment, she requested from her tactical officer. Admiral, we have confirmed successful strikes against coalition targets in 47 systems over the past month, Lieutenant Commander Park reported. Estimated enemy casualties include 12 heavy cruisers, 31 escort vessels, and approximately 200,000 personnel. Total resource cost to achieve these results was equivalent to the industrial output of 6 asteroid mining facilities. The mathematics of the exchange were brutally favorable to humanity. Each Damocles weapon cost less than a single coalition escort vessel to build and deploy, but could destroy entire fleets when properly positioned. Human crews volunteering for suicide missions eliminated the need for complex guidance systems or defensive measures. The weapons were crude, inefficient, and absolutely devastating when used by people who had nothing left to lose. Admiral Vasquez activated her communication link to the scattered human settlements that still maintained resistance operations throughout known space. The network had become remarkably efficient despite the loss of their major communication hubs, with individual facilities maintaining contact through quantum entanglement transmitters that were nearly impossible for alien forces to detect or intercept. All human forces, this is Earth Defense Command, she broadcast across the emergency frequencies. We have confirmation that coalition leadership is requesting negotiation protocols from the Hegemony Council. Maintain current operational tempo and prepare for potential diplomatic contact. The response came back from dozens of facilities across human space, each transmission carrying the same message that had sustained their resistance since the first child died at New Brisbane: no negotiation until alien forces withdrew completely from human territory and provided guarantees that no human children would ever again be threatened by alien action. It was not a reasonable negotiating position. It was not a practical basis for ending the conflict. It was the absolute minimum that humanity would accept, and they would continue building Damocles weapons until they achieved it or until every human being in the galaxy was dead. The coalition was beginning to understand that those were their only options. Dr. Rebecca Chen had died in the bombardment of Mars, but her daughter Sarah had survived along with her granddaughter Emma and approximately 40,000 other refugees who had been evacuated to the hidden facility on Kepler 442b. The colony had been rebuilt in the cavern systems beneath the planet's surface, designed to survive orbital bombardment and continue Damocles production even if the surface installations were completely destroyed. Sarah worked 18-hour shifts in the underground weapons facility, assembling fusion warheads with the same precision her mother had brought to the original designs. Around her, other survivors maintained the production systems that turned raw materials into humanity's most effective response to alien aggression. Emma, now 9 years old and still marked by the trauma of watching her classmates disappear, helped with simple assembly tasks when she wasn't attending the underground school where the colony's remaining children learned mathematics, physics, and the engineering principles necessary to build weapons that could destroy starships. It was not the childhood that Sarah had planned for her daughter, but it was the childhood that alien choices had made necessary. "Mama," Emma said during one of their brief rest periods, "when will we stop building the bombs?" Sarah thought about the question that every surviving human asked themselves daily. When would they have killed enough aliens to feel safe? When would the threat to human children be eliminated permanently? When would they be able to stop turning every resource into weapons designed for mutual destruction? When they understand that human children are not acceptable targets, she said. When they learn to leave us alone. And if they don't learn? Sarah looked at her daughter, seeing in her eyes the same determination that had carried humanity through 18 months of warfare against impossible odds. Emma had grown up in a universe where aliens murdered children as negotiating tactics, where survival required constant preparation for violence, where the only safety came from possessing weapons capable of destroying entire civilizations. Then, we keep building bombs until there's nothing left to threaten. The negotiations, when they finally began, took place through quantum communication links that allowed real-time discussion between coalition leadership and the scattered remnants of human command authority. Admiral Vasquez participated from her asteroid base, while Supreme Coordinator Thax Wel transmitted from the coalition capital world of Nexus Prime. The initial exchange established parameters that both sides understood were completely incompatible with any reasonable settlement. The coalition is prepared to offer humanity autonomous status within designated territorial boundaries, Thax Wel transmitted. We will withdraw all forces from your core systems and guarantee non-interference with your internal affairs in exchange for cessation of Damocles weapons production and deployment. Admiral Vasquez consulted with the other surviving members of human leadership before providing their response. The discussion was brief and unanimous. Supreme Coordinator, humanity's terms are as follows: complete withdrawal of all coalition forces from every system where humans maintain settlements. Formal recognition of human territorial sovereignty throughout our current area of operations. Binding guarantees that no coalition member will ever again target human civilians, particularly children, for any purpose. Reparations equivalent to the reconstruction cost of our destroyed worlds and settlements. The silence on the communication link stretched for nearly 5 minutes before Thax Wel responded. Admiral, your